If you told me a year ago that I'd be questioning everything I knew about my marriage, I'd have laughed you off. I'm not the kind of man who doubts easily. My name's David, and for 11 years, I had a life that most people would call stable, secure. I work in systems analysis, a job that keeps things straightforward. I'm a man who likes things predictable, dependable. And until recently, I thought Sarah, my wife, was part of that same steady foundation. Sarah and I had something most people called solid. We weren't flashy. I didn't need grand gestures, and she wasn't the type to push for them. I thought I knew what we had, and I thought I knew her. That was before she started changing slowly at first, and then suddenly in ways that didn't sit right. She began talking about self-care, about needing time to refresh. I try to shrug it off as a phase. Everyone needs a little space now and then, right? But then one night, she came home looking different, fresher somehow. She leaned down to set her purse on the counter, and that's when I saw it. A bruise, faint but clear, right below her collarbone. It wasn't the kind of bruise you get from a trip to the gym. I may be a trusting man, but I'm not blind. That mark looked suspiciously like a love bite, and in that moment, every instinct told me something was wrong. I could have demanded an answer right there, could have laid it all out, but I held back. I wasn't about to jump to conclusions without something solid. From then on, though, my eyes were open, and the more I watched, the more I noticed things weren't adding up. She was out more often, dressed up in ways she never used to for errands that took hours. She was cagey with her phone, kept it closer than she kept me some days. So I did what any man would do when he's getting suspicious, started looking closer. One evening, she slipped outside to take a call, leaving her phone unlocked on the counter. I saw a notification light up. It was from a Brian. Brian, a name that hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just anyone. Brian was supposed to be my friend, someone I trusted. I could feel my blood start to boil as I tapped the message open. Tonight was amazing, it read. Just 4 little words that told me everything I needed to know. It took everything in me to hold back right then, but I wasn't about to make a scene on guesswork alone. The next day, I put a tracker on her car. I told myself it was just a precaution, a chance to know what I was dealing with. And if I was wrong, she'd never have to know. But deep down, I knew. I'd seen enough. Over the next few days, the tracker confirmed what I'd suspected. She was spending time at Brian's place, frequently, shamelessly, always when she thought I wouldn't know. And when she came home with some lazy excuse about shopping or traffic, I nodded along, all the while feeling a cold anger settle in my chest. She thought I was that oblivious, that trusting. Well, she was in for a surprise. I kept my mouth shut, but inside, I felt something raw and sharp taking shape. This wasn't just a betrayal of me. It was an insult. I'd given her loyalty, stability. And Brian, well, he'd known me since college. I'd helped him out more times than I could count, given him a place in my life. And this was how they repaid me? That night, sleep didn't come easy. I was too wired, too angry to pretend that life could go on like nothing had happened. But I wasn't about to confront them on impulse alone. No, I needed to be smart. If they thought they could carry on behind my back, they'd have to think again. I was going to make them see the consequences of betraying a man who trusted them. From then on, every word, every smile I gave her felt like a mask I had to wear. I played along, but each day I was calculating, planning. I'd already seen enough to know the truth, but I wanted more. This wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. They needed to learn that when you betray someone who's stood by you, it doesn't end with a few heated words. After installing the tracker, I told myself I'd let it go for a few days just to see if I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew I wasn't wrong. Sarah had been acting strange, lying so easily it was almost insulting. And as for Brian, I couldn't even bring myself to think about the years of friendship I thought we'd had. I wasn't the type to let people get away with using me, and they were about to find that out. On Wednesday night, I checked the tracker. Sure enough, Sarah's car was parked in a neighborhood far from any store or office she had business being near, right outside Brian's place. It took everything in me not to jump in the car, drive over, and confront them both right then and there. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching me lose my cool. They weren't worth it. Instead, I stayed calm, steeling myself for what needed to be done. Each day, I'd log in and check the tracker, keeping an eye on her movements and watching her stories unravel. She'd come home, casually mentioning traffic or an extra errand that kept her out longer than expected. It was laughable. Every word she said made my anger burn hotter, but I stayed collected. This was more than revenge now. This was justice. I was going to gather everything I needed, make sure they wouldn't wriggle out of the mess they'd created. A few nights later, she gave me another excuse. Something about a last-minute trip to a self-care seminar she'd heard about. I let her go without a word, and as soon as she left, I checked the tracker. She wasn't at any seminar. She was on the same route to Brian's place. They had no idea they were being watched. I let them carry on like fools, recording every movement, every stop, every minute she spent in that house. Each time, the tracker confirmed exactly what I suspected. They were so comfortable in their lies, they didn't think twice about sneaking around on my time. But they were about to regret that. By the end of the week, I had a solid collection of data, dates, times, locations, everything. I kept careful notes, screenshots of the tracker app, and even printed maps of her errands. I wasn't some guy she could push around, some chump who'd be left in the dust while she played house with my so-called friend. Every piece of evidence I gathered was fuel for what I was planning, something they'd never see coming. The lies from Sarah kept piling up. Traffic was terrible, she'd say. I had to stop for groceries. She'd even complain about the lines at stores she hadn't been within miles of. I'd nod, keeping the disgust from showing on my face, but each excuse was like a nail in the coffin. She didn't realize I could see right through her, and she didn't realize I wasn't going to let her slip away from this. By now, the shock had worn off, replaced by something colder. I wasn't here to beg for answers. I was here to make her pay. One night, she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she stepped outside to take a call. I knew who she was talking to. Without hesitation, I picked it up and quickly scrolled through her messages. My stomach clenched as I saw dozens of texts between her and Brian. It was all there in black and white. Everything from late-night plans to meet up to little messages of love and affection that made my skin crawl. My blood ran cold, but I kept myself from reacting. This wasn't the time to explode. No, they were going to face the full force of my response, and they wouldn't see it coming. The next day, I confronted Brian in a different way, by planting a little surprise. I slipped a recording device into her car. Now, I'd have more than location data. I'd have their words, too. I'd let them dig themselves deeper, gathering every last piece of evidence I needed to turn this back on them. If they thought they'd get away with this, they were sorely mistaken. I wasn't interested in a screaming match. I was interested in making sure they felt the consequences of betraying a man who'd done nothing but trust them. Days turned into weeks, and I watched Sarah's lies grow bolder, her excuses almost taunting. She'd come home with that smug look, assuming I was none the wiser. I'd ask her about her day, let her spin whatever story she needed to feel secure, and all the while, I was sitting on a mountain of evidence. Her late nights, her text messages, her laughter as she whispered things to Brian that she'd once said to me. Every time I thought about it, I felt a fury surge through me that made it hard to sleep, but I channeled it all into the plan I was putting together. A confrontation wouldn't cut it. They needed to understand the price of betrayal. I started to think about how I'd finish this, about what kind of ending they deserved. They were so sure of themselves, so comfortable. If Sarah thought she could play me for a fool, she was in for a reality check. And as for Brian, he'd learn exactly what it meant to stab a friend in the back. No, I wasn't going to scream and yell. I wasn't going to let them brush me off or twist this into some pathetic plea for forgiveness. Instead, I was going to watch as they fell right into the trap they'd built for themselves, one careless lie at a time. When I finally confronted them, they'd have no idea what hit them. By now, I had seen and heard more than enough to know exactly what was happening between Sarah and Brian. The shock, the hurt, those emotions had burned off, leaving something else entirely in their place. I was done pretending to be the clueless husband, the guy they thought was too blind to notice. Now, every time I looked at Sarah, I felt a hard, steely anger taking over. I didn't care what excuse she had or what her reasons were. She'd made her choice, and Brian had made his too. And now they'd have to live with the consequences. The more I watched, the more I saw how comfortable they'd gotten with the lies. Sarah would go out, casually dressed in the new clothes she thought I hadn't noticed, and come back with that same self-satisfied smile, thinking she'd fooled me again. She didn't know I'd been tracking her every move, watching her go to Brian's house, staying there for hours, and then coming home like nothing had happened. It was almost laughable. She really thought she could keep up this charade. Each new lie only made me more determined to see this through, to make sure they regretted every last minute of their betrayal. It wasn't just the affair itself that cut deep. It was the insult of it, the way they decided they could use me like I was some kind of blind, trusting fool. I'd been there for Sarah, I'd trusted Brian, and they'd both thrown that trust back in my face. I wasn't about to let them get away with that. I wasn't the kind of man who just rolled over and took it, who'd look the other way and pretend nothing had happened. They'd crossed a line, and I'd make sure they knew it. Each day, I kept gathering evidence. I checked the tracker, log her movements, and listened to the recordings I'd planted in her car. I even started taking screenshots of her texts with Brian, printing out every exchange, every little "I can't wait to see you," and last night was amazing. I was building a file, a record of every single betrayal. This was about more than confronting her. It was about showing her and Brian exactly what they'd done, making sure they couldn't deny it, couldn't wriggle out of it with any excuses or lies. I wasn't interested in explanations anymore. I was interested in results. One night, she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she stepped outside for a call. I knew exactly who she was talking to. Without hesitation, I picked it up and scrolled through her messages. Dozens of texts with Brian filled the screen, each one more infuriating than the last. They talked about their plans, about how much they missed each other. There was no mistaking it. They weren't just fooling around. They were deeply involved, and from the looks of it, they had no plans of stopping. I took photos of the messages with my own phone, adding them to the growing collection of evidence. The thought of confronting her right there crossed my mind, but I held back. No, that would be too easy. They weren't going to get away with a simple shouting match. They deserved worse. I thought back to all the times I'd trusted them, let them into my life, believed in the friendship Brian and I shared, the partnership I thought I'd built with Sarah. And what had I gotten in return? Lies, deceit, and betrayal. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became, but it was a cold anger, focused and sharpened. This wasn't about losing my temper. This was about making sure they understood exactly what happens when you betray someone who has only shown you loyalty. I could have confronted them 100 times over, thrown all the evidence in their faces and demanded answers. But what good would that have done? They'd just lie again, spin their excuses, try to make me feel like I was the one overreacting. No, I was going to hit them where it hurt, where they'd feel it for a long, long time. I wasn't interested in a moment of satisfaction. I wanted to make sure they'd look back on this as the moment everything fell apart. As I watched them over the next few weeks, I saw just how comfortable they'd gotten with the deception. Sarah would come home after hours at Brian's, acting like everything was normal, like we were still the same couple we'd always been. She'd smile, ask me about my day, go through the motions like she didn't have a care in the world. And Brian? He'd have the nerve to call me up now and then, talking to me like a friend, like he wasn't stabbing me in the back every chance he got. The audacity of it was almost impressive. But that only made me more certain of what I had to do. The plan started forming in my head, piece by piece. I'd let them keep on thinking they were in control, let them believe I was none the wiser while I set things in motion. They'd keep playing their little games, and then, when they least expected it, I'd turn the tables on them. I wanted them to feel the same humiliation, the same pain they'd put me through. They thought they were untouchable, that they could carry on like this without any consequences. But they were about to find out how wrong they were. Every night, as I lay awake, I refined the details of what I was going to do. I'd watch them, gather every last piece of evidence, and then, when the time was right, I'd make my move. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about making sure they understood the weight of what they'd done. I wanted them to feel it in their bones, to wake up every day with the same sense of dread I'd felt when I realized they'd betrayed me. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. They wouldn't see it coming. They'd never expect me to do what I was planning, and that's exactly why it would work. Sarah thought she knew me, thought I was the kind of man who'd turn the other cheek, who'd let her walk all over me. Brian thought he could stab me in the back and get away with it. They were both wrong. I was going to make them pay, and I was going to do it on my terms. So I waited, biding my time, letting them dig themselves deeper and deeper. Every lie, every visit to Brian's house, every message they exchanged was another nail in their coffin. They thought they could control the narrative, that they held all the cards. But I was about to show them that I'd been holding the winning hand all along. When the time came, I wouldn't just expose them, I'd destroy them. And as I watched Sarah leave the house that night, heading off to run errands that I knew would end at Brian's door, I felt a calm settle over me. The anger was still there, but it was tempered now, focused. They were the ones who'd built this illusion, who'd lied and schemed and thought they could hide it forever. All I was doing was making sure they saw the consequences of their actions, that they faced the truth they'd tried so hard to avoid. They thought I was a fool. They thought I was weak. But they were about to learn what happens when you cross a man who has nothing left to lose. With each new detail I uncovered, my plan took clearer shape. Sarah and Brian thought they'd been clever, that their lies were airtight. But I'd seen through every word, every smirk they exchanged when they thought I wasn't looking. They'd built themselves a little fantasy world, and they had no idea that it was about to come crashing down. I spent hours replaying the recordings I'd taken, listening to their pathetic whispers, their stolen moments, the cheap, stolen intimacy they'd found at my expense. The hurt had burned off by now, leaving only cold determination. Each word I recorded, each lie she told me, only sharpened my focus. One night, I tracked Sarah to Brian's place again. She didn't come home until after midnight, her eyes bright with some forced innocence as she walked in. I barely looked up from my book when she mumbled something about losing track of time with an old college friend. The same recycled story she'd used a dozen times before. I didn't bother responding. I simply watched her, feeling like a hunter eyeing his prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I decided it was time to move my plan from thoughts to action. Enough gathering evidence. It was time to turn this web of lies back onto them, to make sure they'd have no escape when the hammer finally fell. I wasn't going to confront them with accusations. I wasn't interested in hearing their explanations, their excuses, their pleas. They were going to face something far worse than my anger. They were going to face the reality they'd tried to avoid. The next day, I started gathering the supplies I'd need to set the scene, to create a story they'd have no way of explaining. I purchased a few items from different stores around town, some plastic sheets, a small voice recorder, gloves, and a few other essentials. Nothing unusual by itself, nothing that would raise any eyebrows, but each item had a purpose in my plan. I was meticulous, careful, planning every detail. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about making sure they'd feel the full weight of their betrayal. Over the next few weeks, I practiced my setup, testing out each part to make sure it would be foolproof. I spent hours in our garage, making sure everything was just right. I'd use my own blood for the scene, drawn carefully over time so that I'd have enough to make it look convincing. I'd learned a thing or two about blood spatter patterns over the years, enough to make sure this would look real. I wasn't interested in a simple confrontation. I wanted a scene that would make them doubt their own sanity, that would leave them trapped in a nightmare of their own making. When I had everything ready, I waited for the perfect opportunity. Sarah had a work trip planned for the following weekend. It didn't take a genius to know exactly where she'd be staying, Brian's place, no doubt. The thought of her cozying up with him, using my absence as her excuse, was almost too much to bear. But I held it together, knowing that this was all part of the plan. She'd walk into his house, thinking she was safe, while I set the stage for what would come next. On the night she left, I followed her route, watching as she parked her car down the street from Brian's. As soon as she was inside, I made my way to the scene of what would look like the crime of a lifetime. I parked in a secluded lot and pulled out the supplies I'd prepared: the plastic sheets, the blood containers, and even a discarded pair of gloves. I wasn't leaving anything to chance. Every detail was meticulously planned, every action calculated to make this as real as possible. At the park, under the cover of darkness, I laid out the scene, carefully splattering blood on the car seats, the passenger side, and along the trail leading toward a wooded area. I dragged a weighted bag through the dirt, creating tracks that looked like a body had been moved, as though some horrific scene had unfolded here. When I was done, it looked disturbingly real. Anyone who stumbled upon this would see exactly what I wanted them to see: evidence of violence, a crime with no clear answers, no sign of a culprit. Just a trail of clues leading to Sarah and Brian. The final touch was the voice recording. I left it in the car, set on a timer to play a chilling sound. A few screams, a scuffle, muffled words, things that would make any investigator stop in their tracks. I'd leave just enough to create doubt, enough to make them look guilty without a single word from me. I knew that with the evidence I'd planted, there would be questions, accusations, and more than enough doubt to ruin them both. When I finished, I stood back, taking in the scene one last time. It was perfect. They'd have no way to explain this, no way to talk their way out of it. This wasn't just revenge. This was poetic justice. They betrayed me, lied to me, treated me like I was nothing. And now, they were going to face the consequences. I left the scene quietly, disposing of the gloves and any remaining evidence that could link back to me. As I drove home, a calm washed over me, a satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. They thought they could walk all over me, that I'd let them carry on without any repercussions. But they were about to learn that when you betray someone like me, the consequences are severe. The next day, I went about my business as usual. Sarah called, pretending she was on her work trip, telling me how exhausted she was from all the meetings. I almost laughed, imagining the panic that would grip her soon enough. Let her think she was still in control. She had no idea what was coming. She and Brian had been so confident, so sure that they'd gotten away with it. But all of that was about to change. That evening, I sent an anonymous tip to the local police department, detailing a suspicious scene I'd noticed at the park, claiming to have stumbled upon it while jogging early that morning. I kept my tone casual, calm, like I was just another concerned citizen trying to do the right thing. I included just enough details to pique their interest, knowing they'd go out there, investigate, and find exactly what I'd left for them. Now all I had to do was sit back and wait. The call came that night, late enough that Sarah was already asleep. A detective, calling to ask if I knew anything about her whereabouts that evening. I played my part, sounding confused, concerned. I asked if she was in trouble, wondering aloud what could have happened. The detective mentioned some unusual activity that linked her to the park, and I felt a grim satisfaction as I heard the hesitation in his voice. He was starting to piece it together, starting to see the story I'd laid out. The next day, Sarah's confusion turned into outright panic. She got another call from the police, asking about her visit to the park, about the supposed trail of evidence they'd found. She fumbled through her answers, stammering, giving herself away with every slip of the tongue. I watched her face pale, her hands shake, and I felt a cold satisfaction settle in. She knew she was in trouble, but she didn't know just how deep it went. Over the next few days, the investigation intensified. Brian called, panicked and stuttering, trying to make sense of what was happening. The police questioned him, questioned her, and both of them stumbled over each other, their stories crumbling like the lies they were. Each word, each attempt to explain themselves, only tangled them further, drawing them deeper into the trap I'd set. As I watched the chaos unfold, I felt a calm unlike anything I'd felt before. They thought they could betray me and carry on as if nothing had happened. They'd wanted to lie, to deceive, to play their little games in secret. But now, every move they made was out in the open, every desperate attempt to escape bringing them closer to the downfall they deserved. And I stood back, watching it all with the satisfaction of a man who knew that justice had been served. The first official visit from the police happened 3 days after I set everything in motion. By then, Sarah had gone from smug to unsettled to completely unraveled. She spent hours pacing around the house, her phone glued to her hand, and every time she got another call from Brian, her face turned ashen. It was almost painful to watch her squirm, but then I'd remind myself that every second of her discomfort was well-deserved. When 2 detectives showed up at our front door, she went pale. She tried to wave me off, stumbling through an explanation about a routine misunderstanding. I gave her a long, hard look, then turned to the officers with a calm expression. Please, officers, come in, I said, ignoring her frantic glare. If there's something Sarah can help with, we'd both like to know what's going on. The detectives exchanged glances, and Sarah's face contorted as she realized she'd have no choice but to let them in. She shot me a desperate look, like she wanted me to back her up, but I was done playing her games. She started stumbling through half-baked explanations about being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it was all a misunderstanding, but the detectives were ready. Mrs. Michaels, the lead detective, interrupted her. There was evidence of blood on your vehicle, and it matches your husband's blood type. You understand why we need an explanation. The way she froze, well, it was priceless. I leaned forward, playing my part. What's going on, Sarah? I asked, my voice as controlled as ever. Where were you that night? Why is there blood in your car? For the first time, she looked truly afraid. She tried to hold her composure, but the cracks were there. David, I don't know how that happened. You have to believe me. I didn't do anything wrong. I almost laughed. Now she wanted me to believe her. She stammered through another series of excuses, her eyes darting to the detectives, then back to me. But it was clear she didn't have a single coherent explanation. And as she fumbled, the detectives pressed harder. Mrs. Michaels, your car was found near the scene of what we suspect to be a staged crime, one detective said, barely concealing his frustration. The blood spatter, the drag marks, all signs point to something happening there. I stayed silent, letting her squirm. Her face had gone pale, her eyes wide with the realization that every excuse she tried would only trap her further. She shot me another desperate look, but I met her gaze with a cool stare that told her exactly where I stood. She was on her own, and she knew it. The questions kept coming. They asked her about the night in question, about her whereabouts, and every word she tried to spin only deepened her entanglement. She tried to tell them she'd gone to the park alone, but she couldn't explain the timing or the fact that she'd been seen with another person. Each time she tried to backtrack, she dug herself in deeper. Eventually, they turned to me, asking if I'd noticed any unusual behavior. I played my part well, acting like the concerned husband who was utterly blindsided. Honestly, officers, I said with a calm I barely needed to feign, I've been noticing changes in Sarah's behavior. She's been acting distant, going out at odd hours, saying she's running errands. But I never thought she'd be involved in something like this. Sarah's mouth dropped open, her face a mask of betrayal. But I wasn't about to give her any ground. She had betrayed me long before I'd laid this trap. Now, she was going to face the reality she'd created for herself. The detectives eventually left, but not without leaving a clear message. They'd be back, and they expected answers. As soon as the door closed, Sarah rounded on me, fury and desperation mingling in her eyes. Why didn't you help me? She spat, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you say those things? I looked at her, letting her words settle. Why should I help you, Sarah? I asked, voice cold. You lied to me. You lied about everything. And now you want my help. She faltered, stumbling over her words. David, it wasn't like that. Brian, it's complicated. I scoffed, crossing my arms. Complicated? Is that what you call sneaking around behind my back with a so-called friend? I leaned in, letting every word hit her. You two thought you could fool me. Carry on with your lies. Well, look where that's gotten you. She was shaking now, struggling to hold on to any last shred of control. But there was nothing she could say, nothing that would bring back the trust she'd shattered. Over the next few days, the walls closed in around her. She tried calling Brian, hoping he'd be there to back up her story, but he was in just as much trouble as she was. The police had linked his car to the scene as well, and he was in no position to offer her any support. In fact, their attempts to cover for each other only made things worse, each of them turning on the other to save their own skin. Watching them squirm was almost as satisfying as the day I'd first set the trap. By the end of the week, they were both called in for questioning again. This time, I stayed home, watching from a distance as they tried to explain themselves to a team of detectives who had no patience for their conflicting stories. They floundered, contradicting each other at every turn. And by the time they returned home, they were broken, exhausted, the weight of their lives finally catching up to them. When Sarah got home that night, she barely looked at me. She knew she couldn't talk her way out of this, not with me, not with the police. She walked around like a ghost, the once confident woman now reduced to a shell, desperate and panicked. Every time the phone rang, she jumped, and I knew she was expecting the worst. And as for Brian, he was no better. From what I heard, he was just as much of a mess, desperately trying to salvage his own reputation. They both thought they could turn the tables, twist the truth to save themselves, but each attempt only added to the pile of evidence against them. They'd used me, betrayed me, and now they were each other's downfall. The final straw came a few days later. A new round of evidence surfaced, all thanks to the careful trail I'd left behind. The police linked a set of staged witnesses I'd anonymously created. Fake sightings, fabricated text messages, records that painted a picture of two people caught in a web of lies and deceit. Sarah and Brian tried to explain it all away, but the damage was done. Every lie they told turned against them, each attempt to save themselves only proving their guilt further. Finally, the detectives arrived again, and this time they had no questions. They had answers that pointed straight at Sarah and Brian. They left our home that day with a final warning: either cooperate or face charges. Sarah turned to me one last time, her voice barely more than a whisper. "David, please, you have to help me. This isn't what you think. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." I met her gaze, letting her desperation sink in. "You did this to yourself, Sarah. You and Brian. You thought you could play me, lie to my face, treat me like a fool. Well, now you get to live with the consequences." I turned and left her standing there, alone with the weight of her choices. She had made her bed, and now she'd lie in it, just like she had lied to me. There would be no more excuses, no more explanations, just silence, and the justice that I'd waited so long to deliver. As I walked away, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The confrontation was over. The game was over. And as far as I was concerned, it was time to close this chapter for good. With the police closing in, Sarah and Brian had no one to turn to. Not each other, and certainly not me. Their carefully crafted lies had come back to haunt them, and every day I watched them unravel was like a small victory. But I wasn't done yet. No, the consequences of their betrayal hadn't fully set in. They thought the worst of it was over, but they were wrong. The groundwork was laid, but now I needed to take things one step further. I'd spent months planning for this, and I wasn't about to stop when I was so close to seeing it through. They'd hurt me deeply, and now they'd know what it felt like to lose everything they'd taken for granted. I started by setting up a series of anonymous tips that would lead the police straight to them. Using a prepaid, disposable phone, I called the local precinct with just enough information to keep them interested. I fabricated witness sightings, creating a web of circumstantial evidence that painted Sarah and Brian as more than just innocent bystanders. It was the final nail in their coffin, and I made sure it was tight. The next day, I used that same burner phone to send a message to Sarah's sister, laying out the basics of what I knew. Posing as a supposed concerned friend, I hinted at the affair, mentioning strange nights and suspicious behavior. I knew her sister would spread the news through the family in no time, and with each new person who learned the truth, Sarah's world would shrink further. People would start to distance themselves, to look at her differently, to question her every word, and she'd have no one to blame but herself. A few days later, I arranged for a package to be sent to Brian's workplace, carefully labeled as confidential. Inside, I placed copies of the messages he'd sent to Sarah, photos of the two of them together, and a typed note: "The truth always comes out." I didn't need to be there to see his reaction. I could imagine it well enough. He'd be terrified, paranoid, wondering who knew, looking over his shoulder at every coworker, suspecting them of knowing his dirty secret. His reputation, something he prized more than anything, would take the first major hit, and it would only get worse from there. As for Sarah, she faced her own reckoning. Her family, friends, even her colleagues were beginning to catch wind of the situation. I'd seen to it that every interaction she had would feel like a judgment, every glance a reminder of her betrayal. The gossip spread quickly, fueled by the whispers I'd planted. She tried to brush it off, but the doubt, the shame, was growing on her like a shadow she couldn't escape. But my revenge wasn't just about ruining their reputations. It was about taking away their sense of control, their belief that they could manipulate the situation to suit their needs. They'd already tried to twist the truth, to spin their lies into something they could live with. That's where I'd make my final move. I arranged to meet with my lawyer, preparing the paperwork for a divorce that would leave Sarah with as little as possible. I'd already shifted our joint savings into separate accounts. Assets I'd carefully ensured were solely in my name. When the papers arrived, she'd be blindsided. The home, the car, the life we'd built, it would all be mine. All she'd have left would be the memories and the wreckage of her choices. Then, in one final stroke, I made sure Brian would face the fallout of this betrayal. I'd reached out to a few key contacts, people who had influence over his career. I anonymously sent them details of the affair, photos, even a link to the fake crime scene evidence, hinting that his personal life was a liability. A few calls later, I learned he'd been suspended pending internal review. Watching him lose the job that had been his pride felt like justice in its purest form. Sarah and Brian had thought they'd found a way to sneak around, that they'd outsmarted me. But they didn't know that I'd been 10 steps ahead, that every careless move they'd made had played directly into my hands. With the pieces in place, I knew the final blow was imminent. Brian's suspension from work had sent shockwaves through his social circle. His boss, a no-nonsense type who valued reputation above all, had quietly started an internal investigation. The whispers about his affair had reached his colleagues, and he was now a man marked by scandal. Every move he made was scrutinized, and the people who once respected him kept their distance, unsure if associating with him would harm their own standing. As for Sarah, the fallout was spreading fast. My anonymous tip to her sister had worked like a charm. Her family was outraged, with calls and texts piling up, each one demanding an explanation. Friends who used to drop by for coffee now sent polite apologies, excusing themselves from her life. Social gatherings became a minefield as more people learned the truth. Her world was shrinking one friendship at a time, and there was no escaping the consequences. The life she'd known, the comfort, the stability, was slipping out of reach, and she had only herself to blame. But I had one last move left, a final step that would seal their fate and make sure they could never recover from this betrayal. I called Brian. I kept my voice calm, controlled, and as soon as he picked up, I could hear the tremor in his voice. He tried to play it off, acting like everything was fine, but we both knew it was over. "Brian," I said, letting his name linger, "we need to meet." There was a pause, and I could practically hear his mind racing, scrambling to find a way out. "David, listen, I don't think. Save it. You owe me that much. Meet me at the park. Tonight." I hung up before he could respond, knowing he'd show up. He had no choice. That evening, I arrived at the park just after dark, watching as he approached, shoulders hunched, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like a man who'd lost everything, and I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction as he finally reached me. "David, spare me." I cut him off, my tone sharp. "You think I want to hear your excuses? After what you did, after everything I did for you?" I let the words sink in, watching him struggle for a response. He opened his mouth to speak, but I stopped him with a look. "You know I trusted you. I trusted both of you. And this is how you repay me? Lying, sneaking around like a coward." Brian swallowed, looking away, unable to meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, David. I never meant for it to go this far." I laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed in the quiet night. "Oh, it went far, all right. And now, you're going to pay the price." He looked up, fear and confusion written all over his face. "What are you talking about?" I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. "You're done, Brian. Your job, your reputation, everything you built your life around, it's gone. I've made sure of it." I watched as the realization hit him, his face going pale as he understood the extent of what I'd done. "And Sarah?" he asked, barely above a whisper. "She's facing her own consequences," I replied coldly. "Your little affair didn't just ruin our marriage. It's ruined her relationships, her friendships. She'll never be trusted again. You two wanted to play games? Well, congratulations. You've both lost." I turned, ready to leave him there in his misery, But then he grabbed my arm. David, please. There has to be something I can do, something that... I shook him off, glaring at him with a look that silenced whatever excuse he was about to offer. It's too late, Brian. You made your choice. You and Sarah both. I stepped back, letting the words hang in the air. You're just going to have to live with it. I walked away without looking back, feeling the weight of what I'd done settle over me. This was justice, pure, simple, and final. They'd played with fire, and now they were left with the ashes. It was only fitting. The next morning, I met with my lawyer to finalize the divorce papers. Sarah would get nothing. Every asset was protected, every account locked down. I'd taken care of it all, and when she finally received the paperwork, she wouldn't have a leg to stand on. By the time I left the lawyer's office, I knew it was over. The life we'd shared, the promises we'd made, they were dust, and I was finally free from the weight of her lies. A few days later, I received a message from Sarah, a long-winded text trying to explain her side, begging for another chance, saying she'd made a mistake and that she wanted to make things right. I deleted it without reading the rest. She'd chosen her path, and now she'd have to walk it alone. As for Brian, I heard through the grapevine that he was fired, his colleagues distancing themselves from the mess he'd made. His name had become a byword for betrayal in our circles, his once proud reputation now reduced to whispers and scandal. No one wanted to be associated with him, and he'd have to rebuild his life from scratch. And I felt no regret, no sympathy. They tried to ruin my life, and I'd simply returned the favor. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. In the days that followed, I kept mostly to myself, letting the dust settle. I had no reason to look back. Every loose end had been tied up, every piece of my plan executed. Brian was jobless, a ghost among his former friends, his reputation shattered beyond repair. Sarah's life had crumbled, her family and friends now viewing her as a stranger. There was nothing left for them to cling to. And me? I was ready to move on, free of the burden they'd both tried to lay on me. Then, one afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Sarah's father, Tom. He was a good man, someone who'd been like family to me. And though we hadn't spoken since everything unraveled, I wasn't surprised to hear from him. I could sense the disappointment in his voice, the weight of a father's heartbreak as he explained how betrayed he felt by Sarah's actions. But there was something else in his tone, a quiet resolve. David, I know what she did, and I know it's unforgivable. I want you to know that we're behind you in whatever you choose to do. She's lost everyone's trust, he said, his voice breaking. Hearing him say that only confirmed what I already knew. Sarah was outcast, her family disowning her. There would be no one to take her side, no one to offer her comfort. She was truly on her own. Thank you, Tom. I replied, a sense of closure settling over me. But the twist came a few days later. I was out running errands when I ran into Brian's wife, Linda. I hadn't spoken to her since this all began, and though I expected anger, maybe even hatred, in her eyes, I was surprised to find only sadness. David, she said quietly, stopping me in the middle of the store aisle. I know everything. I know what he did, and I know what you did too. For a moment, my pulse quickened, but she continued, her voice low and steady. I don't blame you, you know. In fact, I respect you for what you did. Brian deserved every bit of it. The words hung heavy between us. She gave me a nod, then turned and walked away. And as she disappeared down the aisle, I felt a sense of relief I hadn't anticipated. She understood. She'd seen the whole thing unfold, and she didn't blame me. She even respected me for it. It was a validation I hadn't expected, and yet it brought with it a strange sense of peace. Over the next few days, I could feel that the chapter was finally, truly closing. My world was lighter, quieter, free of the constant lies and deception that had plagued me for months. Sarah's messages dwindled and finally stopped. She'd given up on trying to make amends, finally accepting that there would be no forgiveness here. Brian's name disappeared from our circles, a mere shadow of a man who'd lost everything he once valued. And as for me, I realized I no longer thought of them with anger. I'd finally made peace with the way things had turned out. I went about my life quietly, keeping to myself, grateful to finally be rid of the weight they'd tried to place on me. They had each other to blame, each lie, each betrayal building a prison they'd built with their own hands. And as far as I was concerned, justice had been served. Months have passed now, and life has settled into something that feels real again. My days are calm, filled with small things I'd taken for granted, an unbroken morning routine, quiet weekends, the steady rhythm of my own life. The chaos they brought is a memory, and I'm grateful it's finally over. There's a peace in knowing I stood up for myself. For too long, I let Sarah and Brian take advantage of my trust, my loyalty, believing they could twist it without consequence. But they know now. They'll carry the weight of their choices, each living with a fractured world of their own making. The friends they betrayed, the family bonds they shattered, none of it can be undone. I'm not the same man I was before. That's the truth, and I've accepted it. Betrayal changes you, molds you into something harder, stronger. And I've learned something in the process. No one deserves blind loyalty, not if they're willing to toss it aside the way they did. I used to believe that marriage meant standing by someone through anything, but now I know there are limits. And that's okay. It's better even. Looking back, I don't regret a thing. They forced my hand, and I gave them the justice they earned. I've let go of the anger now, though. I don't have the energy to waste on them anymore. Life moves forward, and so do I. I don't know what comes next, but I'm ready. I've cut ties with everyone who doesn't belong in my life, keeping only those who've proven themselves true. And for the first time in years, I feel free.